Hi, this is Jeff Mann, and we're going to do another critical review video for my YouTube channel. And I'm doing it here with Jim George, and this is our third video project that we've done together. The first video project we did was in December of last year, when we did a 7-hour video which I called How to Perform a Golf Swing Like a PGA Tour Golfer. And in that video I expressed my opinions on how I think the optimum way to perform a golf swing. Then, about a month ago, I did another video, which I called Critical Review Video, on Mike Malaska's golf swing action. And what I'm going to be doing today is I'm going to do another critical review video, and in this video I'm going to be analyzing Jim Hardy's release action as expressed in this book, which he recently published, called The Release, Golf's Moment of Truth, written by Jim Hardy. And I have many notes over here which I'm going to refer to during the video. Now, when I do these videos, I always have to give an introduction and say that we're doing this in the Department of Exercise Sciences in an empty room here, and it's done indoors. And when I start speaking, I'm going to just do this in one take without any editing, which means I'm going to be standing here for an hour, 2, maybe 3 hours talking about the topic. And one of the problems that I've always found that sometimes I lose track of what I'm saying and I get a little off topic and I have to come back on topic. And I also have many slip of the tongue errors. That is a problem. So I might be describing something like this, and I say I'm swinging my right arm when in fact I'm swinging my left arm. So that's a slip of the tongue error when I say right when I meant left. Or I might say that, demonstrate something like this, and I would say the left forearm is pronating when obviously it's not pronating, it's supinating. So if I make these type of slip of the tongue errors, you must just ignore them. The other fact that you need to be aware of is why is Jim George here, and the reason why he's here, he's absolutely critical to this video project, because I have too many physical disabilities that prevent me from demonstrating a golf swing in an optimal manner. So I will do a lot of the talking, and I'll do demonstrating with a short iron club or with a little badminton racket. And when I'm doing the demonstrating, it's very important that you just listen to what I say. And if I seem to not demonstrate it in a way I'm describing verbally, then you must sort of ignore what I'm sort of demonstrating and listen to what I say. And I will constantly get Jim to demonstrate the action because he's a superb golfer and he can perform it in the way that I would like to be able to do it. So I'm going to start off to describe this project. Basically, Jim Hardy, who's very famous for his books on the one-plane swing and the two-plane swing, in producing this new book on the release, has basically focused his attention on two forms of release. The one form he calls the left arm outward pull. So the left arm pulls outwards. And the other one he calls the right arm inward throw. And I'm going to go into great detail describing these two different release actions. And when I'm describing them in detail, my intention is not to teach anyone how to do that, but simply to describe it in enough detail so that you can understand what Jim Hardy is more or less saying. And I hope to get it reasonably accurate in my description. Then what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to describe a totally different way of thinking about the release, which is the way I tend to think about it and which I described in my video project. And then I'm going to contrast the two different ways of thinking about how to perform a release, because they are so extremely different. And then obviously I'm biased because I obviously favor my way of thinking about the golf swing. But you as an independent viewer who's watching this video can simply listen to the rationale that I give, and then you could decide which one you think would work better for you if you decide to perform the Jim Hardy type of release actions, or whether you decide to perform the type of release actions that I will describe later. So I'm going to start off and describe what Jim Hardy means by the left arm outward pull release. And I will refer to this as the LOP release. And when I talk about the right arm inward throw release, I'll refer to that as the RIT release. Now, Jim Hardy is famous for the concept of a two-plane swing. And in a two-plane swing golfer, they often stand erect and they take their arms quite high above and they come down a steep plane with essentially the arms swinging up and down in front of the body. And therefore, Jim Hardy always described it as a more gentle arc around the body, while a one-plane swing golfer tends to be bent over more, and the feeling is that the arms are swinging around the body as the body rotates in space. So it's a more rotary motion, and therefore the club head arc in a one-plane swing is more horizontal to the ground, while in a two-plane swing golfer, he comes down steeply, the arc is more gentle as it's prescribed in space. So when we talk about the release, Jim Hardy thinks of it very differently to the way I think of it. So when he talks about the release, he says you need to think of how you're moving the arm and the golf club from roughly this level to this level here. So in the downswing, you would be somewhere here, coming towards waist level, P5.5, swinging through impact to your follow through at a point here. And this would be what he calls the release zone. Now he says there's two ways to perform a release. And the one way is the LOP release, which he thinks fits very well for a two-plane golfer. Now, as I said, a two-plane golfer at his end backswing starts off, and I'm doing it from down the line, takes the club up to the end backswing, and if you use a neutral grip, like I'm doing, then you can see how I'm pronating my left forearm to get onto a plane. And a two-plane golfer often has the left arm steeper than the shoulder turn like that. Bubba Watson would be an example. Phil Mickelson would be an example. Davis Love III would be an example of a golfer who has a two-plane swing. Now, in performing the LOP release, the feeling as you start the downswing is pulling with your left arm. So you're pulling the club down the plane. Now, in terms of the steepness of the plane, if you would get me that red rod, Jim Hardy refers to two roughly planes. And the one plane he refers to is a hand plane. So if you stand at address with your hands, your arm vertical like that, and your club shaft on a plane like that, this plane, if you look at it, it goes towards my belt buckle. He calls that the original shaft plane, and I'm going to call that the hand plane. Then as you go up to your end backswing, you get into a plane that's at shoulder level. So if you have to draw a line from the ball target line to the shoulder. So if you imagine a steeper plane, which he calls the shoulder plane, then in a LOP release, the feeling is that you're coming down the steep plane, pulling like this as the club shaft comes down. And you're pulling it virtually all the way towards impact. Now, in the backswing, Jim Hardy says, you can see how the club face, which is, if you have a neutral grip, is parallel to the watch face, which is, represents the back of my left lower forearm, and also roughly the back of your hand. So at your end backswing position, and you look like that, what people refer to as a neutral appearance of the club face there, Jim Hardy says it's actually rotated relative to the club head arc in your backswing 90 degrees. And therefore, to come into impact, you're going to have to rotate it to get a squared impact. Now, what he states when it comes to the LOP release is that you're pulling down and you're keeping this 90 degrees open. In other words, as you pull your left arm down and outwards towards the ball target line, the club face is not closing yet. Then at a certain point, the club releases at this point, and you're getting closer to impact. Then let's think of what the right arm's doing. So the right arm of your end backswing is roughly, say, 60 to 90 degrees relative to the what I call the intact flying wedge. And as you're pulling down, you can see there's air between my right forearm and my left arm, which is pulling outwards like that. But as you get closer to the impact, notice that that air disappears as this right arm starts straightening in your late downswing. And as you get closer to impact, you can see that my right arm becomes what he calls the plane arm. In other words, it becomes aligned with the club shaft, and it could be almost straight in line as you come in very close to impact. Then what he states is that from that point on, the club is propelled by the right arm. So in other words, in your LOP release, you're pulling down with the left arm most of the way to the downswing until you get very close to impact. Then as you reach a point somewhere here, the right arm becomes what he calls the plane arm, and the right forearm starts to pronate, which then moves, watch this motion, it moves the whole club shaft from behind my hands to in front of my hands in the follow-through. And in this motion, you can see how my right forearm is pronating. Now, Jim Hardy states to perform this LOP release correctly, you have to, as you get closer to impact, slow down the left arm. So it has to stall so that the right arm can then do this motion like this. If you kept on pulling like this, see, then you're dragging the handle. And he doesn't want that to happen. He says you've got to slow the left arm down, then the right forearm pronates. Now, in my YouTube video, will have a short section underneath it where I'll give information on the video. And one of the links that I'm going to provide over there has to do with a drill, a video that Jim Hardy done, which he called the release drill for two-playing golfers. And in that drill, he demonstrates, and I would encourage you to watch it because there's always a chance that I'm not demonstrating things perfectly. And therefore, if you watch Jim Hardy do it, you'll get an idea of what he's saying. That basically, watch the behavior through impact. This is the motion. Now, if you look at the club face, I mentioned in the LOP release, it's coming down the plane and it's still open to the club head arc. But as you get closer to the impact, as the right forearm starts to pronate, notice how the club face is squaring. So hopefully you get a squared impact, and then after impact, notice how it's closing. So in this zone here, before impact, you can see that the club face is going from very open to very closed. And he refers to that as a high ROC release action. And ROC stands for rate of closure of the club face. So if you picture the club head arc around your body and you're swinging the club around your body, the club face relative to the club head arc in an LOP release in this zone is rotating very fast like this through impact. So it has a high ROC. Now in terms of the motion, Jim Hardy says that as the right forearm, at this point your right arm's actively straightening and pronating, this left hand should not impede its motion because it's now the dominant swinging arm. And in fact, he uses the word hitting, which to me implies he means that the right arm is actively moving through impact. And in its motion, he describes the left hand has to get out of the way. And what he says that the left hand could do in that drill is the left hand would bend like that. That's one option. The other option is you could rotate your left forearm out of the way. So he demonstrates the two. And the right hand, as it pronates like this, the right wrist in his release action is also straightened. You see that? And when it straightens, you can see it could roll over, or it could straighten and more under. You see that? And it's bending the shaft. And then eventually you complete the swing. So I'll get Jim here to demonstrate this LOP release because he can do it better than me. And we'll do it from face on first. Okay, step back a little bit. And he'll go to the end backswing position. And so the end backswing position, I'm going to get him to get a little steeper, more like, say, a two-planer who gets a little higher over there. And as he starts the downswing, notice that the club face has opened 90 degrees relative to the club head arc. Now, as he starts this left, the feeling is that you pull in with your left arm downwards and outwards towards the ball, right? Then the club starts to release, starts to catch up as the left wrist uncocks, getting to a point here. Then you'll notice at this point the right forearm and the club shaft become more aligned. Then this becomes what the plain arm. And then through impact, he's going to pronate and straighten the wrist, right? And then follow through. And notice that the left wrist is bending to allow and not the right wrist to straighten and the right forearm to pronate in that way. And you'll notice that here the toe is up. And notice from impact to here how it's closing. While before impact, let's go back there, notice how open it is there, open, open, and now in the last, say, 6 to 12 inches. So in the LOP release, which Jim Hardy thinks fits very well for a two-plane golfer, it has what we call a high ROC. And Jim Hardy, I do believe, very much favors the alternative release, which he calls the right arm throw release. And he believes that release is optimum. I do believe, although Jim Hardy says there are two ways to perform a golf swing, you could be a two-planer and a one-planer, I think in his heart he really loves the one-plane golf swing, and therefore he's going to love what he calls the right arm throw release. So I'm now going to describe the right arm throw release as he described it in his book. And occasionally I might go to my reference notes to read certain points in quite detail. But in the beginning I'm just going to do an overview. So I'm going to do it from the thing. So one thing about a one-plane golfer, let's say Matt Kuchar would be a very good example, is that he's more bent over at the waist, his shoulders turn on a slightly steeper angle, rather than more horizontally, let's say like Phil Mickelson, because Phil Mickelson stands more erect and turns this way. Well, Matt Kuchar's in a one-plane golf and the shoulders turn, but the left arm is below the shoulder turn angle. Then the feeling is, from the top of the swing, you're trying to throw with your right arm from the very top. So the feeling is it's a throwing motion of the right arm from the top of the swing all the way through impact in one continuous motion. So the right arm throw motion, not only is going to guide the club through the entire release action, but it's actually going to power the swing. It's the power component, the throw action. Now, how do you perform the throw action? So remember, you have the left arm on the club. So from the top of the swing, Jim Hardy says the club face, if you have a neutral left-hand grip, will also be 90 degrees open. But Jim Hardy claims that the right forearm at the top of your swing is more or less 90 degrees relative to club shifts. And he claims that if you come down and you shallow it down to waist level, that this club face will automatically become square. That's what he claims in his book. And I believe that's impossible, and I'll go into detail later. So he implies that when you get to waist level, the club face is already square to the arc. Then this is the motion that you would then be performing. So if you were here and this club face is square to the arc, and you now obviously straightening, you throw it. It's a right arm throw action where you straighten the right elbow, straighten the right wrist like that. The key advice he gives in his book, and he does it in capital letters and he states it repeatedly, he says during this right arm throw motion from waist level here to waist level there, is that you should never pronate your right forearm. In other words, you should never perform a counterclockwise rotation of the right forearm through the releaser. Because he says if you are square with your club face square to the club head arc here, and watch me throw. Notice that as I'm throwing, I'm not rotating the forearm. So that allows the club face to be square to the club head arc through the entire release zone, theoretically. I will go and explain later that that's actually impossible, and I'll explain. But conceptually, he says that's what you should be doing. Now, when you come to impact, he states basically that in your throw action, which is actually a feeling that starts from the top of the swing and it's just one continuous motion, that watch there, like if you were throwing a sidearm or an underarm throw, you would allow your, look at my right wrist, to straighten. And he says impact is roughly a point when your right wrist was bent back at the top of your swing like that. By the time you come to impact, it's half straightened, and then at this point you can see it's fully straightened like that. So when you come into your impact, hopefully you're sort of in a position where it's straightened like that. Now, a key component of his description of this right arm throw action is what you do with your left arm. Remember, in the left arm outward pull, this type of release action, the left arm is pulling. And Jim Hardy states very strenuously that you never have that feeling of pulling in RIT. The left arm will come down, but it's a feeling more of dropping down while your right arm is performing this throw action. And then when you get in closer to impact, in your later downswing, this left hand has to get out of the way. And so that it does not impede the motion of the throw, because Jim Hardy says that throw motion has to just be continuous, smooth, fluid, uninterrupted, and that the left hand must not somehow obstruct it. So how do you get your left hand out of the way? The first thing he says, that if you look at the RIT release, is as it's coming down, you'll notice that this arm, instead of going outwards towards the ball, actually comes to a point here where it almost looks like it's hanging vertically. And then as it rotates towards impact, it's getting out of the way. And he often describes a drill where the feeling with the left hand is you're pulling your hands in towards you, almost as if there was a knife in the butt end of your club, that you stab yourself in the thigh like that. See this motion? So it's a pulling in very close to your body like that. So your hands are moving on an inward circle like this. So that's the important thing you have to do with the left arm. Have it very close to your body, your left arm vertical, and you turn it. And it gets out of the way. Then after impact, as the right wrist straightens, Jim Hardy says the left hand should just bend. extend.
He calls it extension. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's the left arm bends or extends. So he has an image in his book of J.B. Holmes who looks like this. See how that's bent? And this hand is fully straightened underneath like that. Now, it's interesting, although he describes it, many of the golfers who use the RIT release, like let's say Matt Kuchar, doesn't do that. I've noticed, and I'll demonstrate at the very end of this video, I've got a laptop and we're going to show images of Matt Kuchar, and then you'll see what Matt Kuchar actually does to get his hands out of the way so that you're in the throw action, is that he is rotating the hand so that this one can pronate out of the way. Now, Jim Hardy is so emphatic that this must not impede the motion of the right arm throw. He says if you can't master this feeling of pulling your left hand inwards like this, he says it would even be acceptable to chicken wing your arm like that, yank it out of the way so that you could do it. And the example of a golfer who does that actually is Lee Westwood. And he thinks that Lee Westwood's a perfect example of an RIT golfer. So if you look at Lee Westwood, he actually comes into impact with a bent wrist. It's actually bent there already. It's bent there, and then you look at Lee Westwood and this arm is chicken wing inwards like that, and then the right arm is the plain arm. So from down the line, you can picture that the right arm is throwing, the forearm is in line with your shaft during the throw. Then from up line, you continue the throw up and around your body like that. Notice during the throw motion that I'm not pronating my forearm at least to about that level, but I'm allowing the right wrist to straighten fully. Your arm goes into full extension around you like that to there, and then eventually you're pronated beyond waist level. So if you've listened to my description of that type of release action, Jim Hardy is describing a swing action which he thinks is very appropriate for one-playing golfers, where the right arm is performing a continuous throw motion. And it's doing everything. It's powering the motion of the club in space. It's controlling the club head arc by going around your body. And one way he says it's very critical, which I didn't mention, is that your right elbow never gets in front of your hip, but it's more alongside your hip. And a critical thing to be a one-planer, which I have a hard time demonstrating because I don't have the flexibility. But when you see Jim Hardy or good one-planers, look how much they rotate, keeping this very close to their shirt seam while they throw. And this rotary motion of the body is necessary to allow the right arm, as it moves around the body, to have a beautiful club head arc that's in to square to in, while the club face theoretically stays square to the arc. Now, the good thing about his release action, and why he thinks it's so wonderful, is that the club face is square to the arc. And he says because the club face is square to the arc through the entire release zone here, that allows you to more consistently hit straight shots. And in his book, he says when you go to the LOP release, which has what he says is this high ROC, he says that's totally unsuitable for hitting straight shots. And if you decide to use an LOP release, he actually recommends that you should either try to draw the ball or fade the ball. Personally, that doesn't make sense to me, because I would agree with Jim Hardy that a high ROC through impact is very undesirable because it requires tremendous timing just to get it square. So I can understand why he says it's hard to hit the ball straight if you're having this high ROC. And therefore his RIT release is very much better. Look at this, where the club face stayed square. But I would also argue that if it's difficult to hit a straight shot because you can't get the timing right as you go from being open to closed, it's going to be difficult to consistently hit a draw or a fade as well. So I'm actually would state quite categorically that in my concept of performing a release action through impact, you should never have a high ROC swing. Then the problem becomes, okay, if you're sympathetic to my point of view, that means that everyone should perform the RIT release because Jim Hardy only offers two alternatives. Now, that's problematic, isn't it? Because, you know, to do this RIT release works very well if you're a one-plane swing golfer. To be a one-plane swing golfer, to do it well requires, Jim Hardy says in his books on the one-plane swing, tremendous flexibility to rotate. And many elderly people, golfers who cannot turn their body in space, so easily are going to have a hard time doing it in a perfect manner. And I believe the problem can be solved if you start to think of the release in a totally different manner. So what I'm going to do...
Do you want me to demo the
RIT? All right, so I'll get...
Just before you move on.
Jim to demo. So it's going to go to his end backswing position. Now, he's going to be more like Matt Kuchar with his left arm a little lower than his shoulder turn angle, but with a steeper there. And you'll notice that the club face is open, 90 degree to the club head arc. Then as he comes down to P5.5, you'll notice the club shaft is shallowing out to a plane by the time it gets to here. It's coming down to your original shaft plane. And if you look at this looks more square to the club head arc. Then, as he goes through impact, notice it stays square to the arc through. Notice that his right, as long as possible, one tries to turn in such a manner that this stays. Now, if you can't, and if you look at Matt Kuchar, for instance, his right arm by elbow eventually bypasses. I mean, Ben Hogan, Sam Snead, who were ultra flexible and ultra fluid, could rotate through and keep this elbow very close to the shirt seam because they had such a beautiful rotary motion of their pivot. But if you can't, then obviously your elbow is going to bypass it. Then you come to impact, and after impact, this is going to be straightening, and this will stay square to the arc. Now, the critical thing, the only way that the club face could stay square to the arc when the right wrist straightens and the left wrist bends, is that you're not having any roll component. So if you had to pronate your forearm here, it would not only change the arc, but it would roll the club face close relative. And Jim Hardy, in his description, wants you to get to this level with this square to the arc as Jim is demonstrating here, as this straightens. This one is bending to allow it to happen. Another feature, let's see if you can demonstrate it, is Jim Hardy talks about an inner circle. So when you're doing the RIT release, your hands are close to your body, and as your body turns, your hands are turning around your body in that arc. So from down the line, as it does it, you can see the club shafts on this shallow plane, like that, through. And I'll go into more detail later, because I first want to describe an alternative way to think of the swing, and then I'm going to compare them in great detail later. Now, I believe in a totally different way of thinking of the golf swing and performing the golf swing. So, one thing you notice about Jim Hardy's two different releases is that he doesn't talk about an active pivot action. In other words, he says in his book that the pivot action is not active. In other words, you don't start with an active pelvic rotation and then an active upper torso rotation, which then throws your arms, in front of your body. He says the body must accommodate itself, be reactive to the arm motion, and I'll go into the different pivot motions between the LOP release and the RIT release a little later. But I'm going to describe an alternative way to think of the swing. And I believe this alternative way is the way that I think actually most professional golfers are performing the golf swing. So this comes from Homer Kelly's book, The Golfing Machine. And Homer Kelly said that basically that if you're holding a golf club in your left hand like this, your left hand's in front of the club, which means it's pulling the club in this manner, while the right hand, because it's behind the club, it can push it. And he called it a pushing action a hitting action, while he called a pull-in action in this manner a swinging action. So I believe that the way to think of the swing is a swinging action of the left arm in this manner. And to me, the best analogy I always think of is a backhanded tennis shot. So here I'm holding the tennis racket, presuming you have a neutral grip. You take your tennis racket there and you swing in the tennis racket in space, pulling it. Now, there are two ways to perform a swinging action. The one way is to use an active pivot, where from your end backswing position, you start off with rotating your pelvis, then you rotate your upper torso. As your upper torso starts to rotate counterclockwise, it moves the left shoulder socket first towards the target, eventually up and inside. And the left arm is connected to the torso through the left shoulder socket. So the left arm is being pulled, or if you want to say swung, or pulled, in the swinging motion. The other way is to have a reactive pivot action. And in a reactive pivot action, and this is a swing technique described by Leslie King, he states from your end backswing position, you should feel that you're just swinging your left arm across your body, allowing your body to react in space and pivot in space. So that's a reactive pivot action. But I believe that most professional golfers are performing an active pivot action driven swing with a left arm swinging motion. And I'm going to get Jim to demonstrate it using just his left arm. So we'll do it from face on and down the line. So he's going to do it in a continuous manner, back and forth. And notice that he starts the downswing with a very active rotation of his pelvis, then his upper body. And notice that the club is being swung actively in a swinging motion with his left arm. And you can see, we'll do it down the line now, and he'll step a little forward so he doesn't hit the wall there. That as he swings through, you'll see that the club head arc is around his body and it's symmetrical to the ball target line. So it's in to square to in, and it's a continuous pulling motion. So the concept of a plain arm being the left arm in the LOP release, like Jim Hardy describes to here, then the right arm becomes the plain arm, does not apply to this swinging action. The right arm never becomes the plain arm. It's a swinging action. Now, the question is how to make this optimally efficient. And I believe that the best way to think of it is to use a technique which Homer Kelly in his book referred to as a left arm flying wedge technique that's on plane. So I'm going to now describe to you the whole concept of performing this TGM swinging action. Just hold that for me. So I mentioned to you, if you watched what Jim here was doing, he was swinging the arms around his body. Now the critical thing as you swing it is you don't want your left wrist to be bending at any time point in the downswing and early follow through, and you're having all this wobble. So the way to eliminate that entire problem is to have what we call an intact left arm flying wedge. So I'm going to demonstrate it first with this larger one. And this is a wedge. And the concept of a wedge is as follows. When you hold a golf club in your hand and you stand at address, notice this V angle here. And this is critically important to understand, that you don't stand with your club straight in line with your left arm like that. You stand like that. and you have this V-shaped angle. That gives it the appearance of a wedge. It's V-shaped, and this fits in there as a wedge. So notice if I stand facing the camera here, that the left arm is in line with my club shaft, and I'll hold that there. That represents a wedge. So in the left arm flying wedge technique, during your entire backswing, entire downswing, and at least to the first part of your follow-through, the left arm and club shaft are always in line. In other words, your left wrist is always what we call geometrically flat. In other words, it might not look flat to the eye, but as long as the club shaft's in line with your left arm, we call that geometrically flat. So here I have it in what seems to be a geometrically flat relationship like that. Now, as we go back like that, you come down in the downswing. At a certain point, the club has to release, because you cock your left wrist up in the backswing and it uncocks in the downswing. But when it uncocks in the plane of the flying wedge. So if you look at this, uncocking, which is ulnar deviation, occurs in the plane of the flying wedge. So the uncocking motion, which happens automatically in the downswing of a left arm swinger, and it occurs according to the laws of physics, the laws of the double pendulum, happens within the plane of the left arm flying wedge. So it doesn't disrupt it. So then you come down the plane and you rotate. Notice that my watch face is facing the camera. So from this point, when you get roughly to waist level, at some point you're going to have to rotate the arms to square the club face, right? Because at the top of your swing it was open. If you're coming down the incline plane, then you see from down the line, notice that the club face is still open to the club head arc, while the club releases, and notice that it's still open, and you're going to have to square the face. So at a certain point in your late downswing, and I'm going to go into detail later, you perform a rotary motion where the entire left arm flying wedge rotates into impact and then through impact. Now, to me, the most wonderful advantage of this technique, not only does it allow you to avoid this problem of floppy wrists throughout the downswing, what it does allow you to do is through impact, it allows you to keep the club face very stable and to have a low ROC, low rate of closure of the club face through impact. And the way that is possible is that as you come in towards impact with an intact flying wedge like that, then let's presume you've now squared the club face. If you can avoid any lift wrist flipping motion like that, you see, and avoid supinating your forearm, rolling your forearm, if you avoid those two biomechanical actions, and then you can control the motion of the flying wedge through impact by rotating the whole intact flying wedge as a unit through impact, which allows you to keep the club face square to the club head arc. And the critical zone for me is the first 12 inches after impact. So impact we refer to as the P7 position, and this position is called half. P8 is there. P7.5 is halfway between impact and when the club is parallel to the ground, and P7.2 is about there. So in this zone, what you want to have is a very low ROC. So that feature it has in common with the RIT release. Now, I'm going to get Jim to demonstrate it with, and I'm going to be standing and demonstrating with a tennis racket, because the flying wedge concept, watch here. See how the racket face is always in line with my watch face. Come down, it rotates to square now, and then it continues to rotate. Notice my left wrist from upline view remains flat, it doesn't bend. Notice the racket face is in line with my arm, which means the intact flying wedge is intact. It's this beautiful fluid motion of the left arm. And I'm going to get Jim to demonstrate it, and I will show you that he keeps an intact flying wedge throughout his entire swing. So, as he starts the backswing, we'll stop at P2 position. So the end takeaway position, you'll notice that this club shaft's in line with his left arm, like that. And that is an intact flying wedge with a geometrically flat left wrist. As he goes further up his backswing, you'll notice that he always keeps the club shaft in line with his left arm, and he doesn't change the degree of dorsiflexion of his wrist. Another thing he's doing as he goes up, he's keeping the whole flying wedge on plane. And what we mean by that is that as you go up, the end of the club that's nearest the ground at any point in your swing, backswing, downswing, and follow through, must always point at the ball target line, and that's called being on plane. So while he's swinging the intact flying wedge up the plane, he's making sure that the club shaft is on plane. So as he's in backswing position there, notice he has an intact flying wedge. Notice that the club face is open by 90 degrees, and it's always the club face in an intact left arm flying wedge is always parallel to your geometrically flat left wrist or the watch face area of your lower forearm. Now when he starts the downswing, notice that he's coming down, and this is an intact flying wedge. And then as the club starts to release, it releases in the plane of the flying wedge, and then in the late downswing, he has to rotate through a left forearm supinatory motion to get the club face square. Now let's see what he does through impact from a face-on view. So here he is at impact with a square club face. Right. Then after impact, he's going to keep on going. Notice that the club face is square to the club head arc. Right? And the club, you know you're having an intact flying wedge when the left arm and the club shaft are in a straight line from a angular rotational perspective. Because if you look at the club head, it's past his arm, and you'll say, well, the club shaft's bypassed his left arm. It seems to be that way, but if you were looking from above, from a bird's eye view, and if you would hold that for me, bird's eye view down, notice in this rotary motion here, that although this racket has now passed my hand, looked at from above, it's still perfectly in line with my left arm. So what Jim is doing in his follow-through is he's made an intact flying wedge. Notice he's got a geometrically flat left wrist, like that. So the great advantage of this technique from my point of view is that it's a continuous swinging motion. I mean, there is a feeling of pulling the club. So as you start the downswing and your hands, the whole flying wedge comes down the plane, you do feel that you're pulling the club. That's why Homer Kelly called that the rope handle technique. So if you didn't have a shaft in your hand, but you had a rope which was inclined parallel to your inclined plane, then you would feel that you're pulling a rope down the inclined plane. But the real feeling is of a swinging motion, like I'm swinging a backhanded tennis shot. Right. Now there is another variation which is absolutely acceptable, and you could even argue it's even better than this technique which I'm described with a geometrically flat left wrist. And that's the concept of having a swinging motion, the same as what I'm doing here, swinging with the left arm, but to do it with a bowed wrist. Now you would say, what's the advantage of doing it with a bowed wrist? Like, instead of, this is a geometrically flat left wrist, while this is a bowed, palmar flexed left wrist. And the reason why I think it has an advantage is that if you're swinging the same motion through impact, a bowed left or palmar flexed left wrist requires activation of muscles in your forearm to keep it bowed, and it's very stable motion through impact. So the golfers who use this technique, there's two ways to use that technique. And the one way is to start bowing your left wrist in your backswing, like Jordan Spieth and Dustin Johnson. An alternative technique is to only start bowing during the mid-downswing. So if you look at Gary Woodland and David Toms, as they come down, they have a geometrically flat left wrist, and you can see the club face is in line with, that's an intact flying wedge. But as they come in down to this point, they start to bow their wrists like that. So as they come down at P5.5, it's bowing like that. And then they come into impact, bowed like that. Now, the amount of bowing changes. So if you just try this yourself, I'll do it with a short tennis racket. So if you want to try that technique that's used by many professional golfers, such as David Toms and Gary Woodland, start bowing it. The feeling is you're swinging your left arm and you're pulling. Now, as you come around the corner from P5.5 to P6.5, it's really palmar flexed. Can you see it? It's very bowed. But because you're just swinging it, the left wrist starts to extend from P6 to impact. So the amount of flexion of your left wrist will be less at impact than it was here. Let's say 20 degrees flexed there. At impact at INE might be, say, 9 degrees flexed. Then, in the next P7 to P7.2, essentially changes very little, maybe 1 or 2 degrees. So that's a perfectly acceptable alternative technique. Now, what makes this technique so interesting, I think, is that you would say, how does it fit in with the concept of being a one-playing golfer or two-playing golfer? How do you accommodate it, this technique? And I'm going to show you how flexible this technique is. So I'm going to do it from down the line. So let's say you're playing tennis. So the ball comes towards you here and you want to hit the ball. Notice in this backhanded tennis swinging action using an intact flying wedge, this angle could vary. I could hit the tennis ball with this almost in a straight line, or I could have almost like a 90-degree angle. In other words, when you're performing this swinging motion of the intact flying wedge, this angle can be anywhere from being closer to 180 degrees to being closer to 190 degrees. Now, this is important to understand because this is a little intricate, but it's critical to understand this point. This angle here, Homer Kelly in his TGM book called it the accumulator number 3 angle. Now, the size of this angle, we talk of a small accumulator number 3 angle and a large. The closer this angle is to 180 degrees, you see like that, we call that a small accumulator number 3 angle. So you come into impact. And in Jim Hardy's LOP release, and he uses Phil Mickelson as an example in his book, he has a low accumulator number 3 angle at impact. Now, an alternative way to swing is not to have your arm outstretched away from your body like Phil Mickelson at impact, but come into impact with your arm vertical and with this angle being much bigger like that. And who looks like that? Sergio Garcia. So Sergio Garcia comes in at a shallow, he comes back to the hand plane or with the original shaft band, and if you look at him in the late downswing, he has a very big accumulator number 3 angle. Now, the versatility of this left arm swinging technique allows you to choose which accumulator number 3 angle you want. Do you want to play golf like Bryson DeChambeau, who has what we call a zero plane shift golf swing, where he takes the club shaft up a steep plane comes down the identical plane and comes into impact looking like that. Now, Phil Mickelson, interestingly, he stands with a moderate size accumulator number 3 angle at address, but when he comes down, he allows his left wrist to only deviate, so that when he comes into impact, he also has a small accumulator number 3 angle. So that's one way to play golf. Alternatively, you could play golf like Ben Hogan or Sam Snead or Hunter Mahan or Keegan Bradley, and if you look at them, they come from the turn shoulder plane up there all the way down to the hand plane. When they come into impact, they have this their left arm is vertical. Now, the question is, which one should you use? And from my perspective, it's optional. In other words, there's no rule or law that says you would choose what works best for you. But I'm going to give you a little bit of advice on how to make it easier to choose these different techniques. So the first thing I'm going to do, and I'm going to walk up to the camera, which hopefully is in autofocus mode, so that I can demonstrate something important here. And that's to do with your grip. Now, when we talk of a grip, that's a neutral left-hand grip like that. So we call it a 2-knuckle grip. You grip the club in your hand and you put your thumb at the 1 o'clock position as looked from above, and you can see 2 knuckles. We call that a neutral grip. So people talk of a neutral left-hand grip, but another way to think of the grip is what is happening in your palm. How do you actually hold the golf club in your palm? So most golfers hold it in what's called a low palmer grip, which is what I tend to do. And Ben Hogan used to demonstrate it like that. So when you hold it in a low palmer grip with the butt end of the club just underneath, this is called the hypothenar eminence, also called the heel pad. You put the butt end underneath it like that, and then you grip it. And then you have what we call a moderate size accumulator number 3 angle. If you decide to hold it in the fingers, which is like that, like you're holding a flagpole vertically like that, that is called a finger grip. And if you look at it, this is a much bigger angle. That's called a large accumulator number 3 angle, and a finger grip does that. Then you could also hold the golf club like Bryson DeChambeau or Mo Norman, famous golfer, where this is across your mid-palm, so the butt end of your club is above the thenar eminence like that. And if you hold the golf club like that, that allows you to comfortably have a small accumulator number 3 angle. Now, I'm going to go back to this position. Because what you need to understand is, if you want to be a golfer who comes down a very steep plane like Bryson DeChambeau or Phil Mickelson into impact, then it makes no sense to use a finger grip, right? It won't work for you so easily. You should choose, as I said, a mid-palmer grip like that. That works very well for a golfer who wants to swing. Look at that. Notice that my club shaft's coming down a steep plane into impact like that. If you want to play golf like Hunter Mahan or Ben Hogan, it would make more sense to have a finger grip like that. So that when you come into it, when you're coming down, you can come in like that. Now, you don't have to have a finger grip to play like that. You could play with a low palmer grip, but just allow, like Sergio Garcia, your right wrist to radially deviate. So in fact, you could use a low palmer grip constantly, and then if you want to play on a steeper plane for your driver, let's say, like coming to impact like that with your driver, then you would need to come into on the deviation, and if you're hitting your short irons and you prefer to come in with your arm more vertical with a larger accumulator, then you would need to have radial deviation. But the important thing you need to understand is that by changing your grip, which you could change the way you come into impact. So it has tremendous versatility. Now, the key question is, not only are we talking about this angle of impact, if you come down like full Mickelson, and you come into impact with a small accumulator number 3 angle, you'll notice that full Mickelson doesn't shallow his club shaft. So it comes down the turn shoulder plane, the club releases in the plane of the flying wedge, and in the last bit of time he squares the face by rotating his left forearm counterclockwise, which is a left forearm supinatory motion. Now, if you decide to swing like Sergio Garcia or Hunter Mahan or Ben Hogan, then you're going to have to shallow your club shaft to this plane. So the question is, how do you shallow it? And I'm going to explain to you how the most biomechanically efficient way to shallow your club shaft. And that brings us to the role of the right forearm. Because I haven't even mentioned what does the right arm do in this type of swing action. So I'm going to describe now the role of the right arm and how useful it is, and gives you the versatility to perform all these different swing actions. The first concept you need to understand is the concept of the right forearm flying wedge. So the right forearm with a bent wrist represents what we call a right forearm flying wedge. And each attached to your body through the right humerus, which is not part of the flying wedge. So the first function of the right forearm flying wedge, I'm going to get Jim to demonstrate down the line, is that it supports the intact flying wedge in your end backswing position. So if you look here at his end backwing position, his right forearm is roughly angled parallel to his spine, and he has a bent wrist. The bent wrist, his right palm is parallel to his intact flying wedge. So the two palms are parallel because he has a neutral left-hand grip. So its function at the end backswing is to support the intact flying wedge. Now, during the downswing, this is what he's going to be doing, right? He's going to be swinging the intact flying wedge down the plane. And the function of the right forearm flying wedge is to perform, you could call it a throw action if you want, or a swinging action of the right arm, in such a way that the right forearm flying wedge is supporting your intact flying wedge on that plane during your early mid-downswing to waist level. Now, this is the key point, is that in performing this action, let's break it down. What are you actually doing biomechanically? So from your end backswing position, the feeling is you adduct your arm towards your side, driving your right elbow down in front of your right hip. Not like Jim Hardy's RIT where he wants it behind the hip. Here you want it in front. And this is a pitch elbow motion, like you skipping stones or baseball pitching like that. Now, it's critical to understand that there are a lot of motions there, but as you perform this motion, look at my right palm. The right palm always, as it comes down, must stay parallel to the inclined plane, so that it can be parallel to the intact flying wedge, which means your right forearm has to be supinated. Now, I'm going to come back to the camera because this is another critical point that you need to understand the definitions correctly. So here I am, and when we talk about the right arm, how do you know whether your right arm is neutral, supinated, or pronated at any point? There are two reference points you need to understand. The one is the middle of your elbow pit, or medically we call that the antecubital fossa. If your right humerus is neutral, it will be facing the camera. If I turn my right humerus internally like that, my elbow pit would face there. If I externally rotated my arm, then the elbow pit. But presuming the elbow pit, the right arm is just upper arm, the right humerus is neutral, this will face the camera. Now, if your radial bone, which is this bone just above your wrist here, which you should be able to feel, is straight in line with that, that is a neutral right forearm. See there? And you can use your hand as a reference point. Notice that my hand is straight in line with this elbow pit, straight in line with my humerus. So that's a neutral right forearm. If I turn my palm to face skywards. We call that supination. Notice that the right radial bone is turning clockwise relative to my elbow pit. That clockwise rotation means that your right forearm is supinated. If I do the opposite, here I am neutral, facing the camera. If I turn my right palm, I keep my elbow pit neutral, I don't move my humerus, so it's facing the camera, but I do this motion to turn my palm to face the ground, that's pronated. And the way you know you're pronated, if you look at a swing video of any golfer, is you look where the radial bone is relative to the antecubital fossa. And if this is rotated more counterclockwise, then you are pronated. So let's go back here to see what actually happens in the golf swing, because this becomes relevant when I'm going to compare to the RIT release. So Jim is going to go to his in backswing position. Now I'm standing here and I'll notice that his elbow pit is here and his radial bone is in line with that. So he has a neutral forearm. Now I'm going to get him to come down like Phil Mickelson without shallowing his club shaft. So when he comes down the turn shoulder plane, his right forearm, if you look at the radial bone relative to that, it's more or less still in line. It's neutral, maybe a little supinated. Now I'm going to get him to shallow his club shaft so that he looks like Ben Hogan or Hunter Mahan all the way down to the thing. In this position, his right forearm is very supinated. Here's his radial bone, and there's his antecubital fossa. So good turn around from face on. So go down, shallow your club shaft from down. If you look at him at this position, this radial bone is not in line, it's rotated clockwise, and his right palm is under the club. So that's the way to know if you're supinated. So if you come down to waist level in your downswing, and your right palm is facing skywards, you're supinated. You're not neutral. Neutral would be like that. This would be pronated, right? Now, how supinated are you? The degree of supination depends on how you shallow the club shaft. So I said to you, the function of the right arm is to support the intact flying wedge with a pitch elbow motion. Now, the more actively you adduct the arm, watch this, the more actively I do it, notice that my hands drop to a shallower plane. But at the same time, notice that I'm turning my palm to a shallower plane, which means I have to supinate it more. So those two phenomena occur in synchrony. That if you are going to want to come down to a shallower plane by your mid-downswing, like Ben Hogan, let's say, you need to adduct your arm very actively and supinate it. Now we're going to do it down the line, and I'm going to show you another way to think about this phenomenon. I mentioned to you we want to keep an intact left arm flying wedge. So here he is at the in backswing position, and you notice he has an intact flying wedge. Now, if he came down the turn shoulder plane without shallowing it, he would still have an intact flying wedge. In other words, if I looked at his antecubital fossa and his humerus and put this wedge in line with his humerus, you'll notice that his shaft, so his humerus, forearm, and club shaft are all in a straight line. If you did it like Phil Mickelson. But Jim, in his own swing, prefers to shallow the shaft down to a shallower plane. Now, the more you shallow it, the more you have to adduct your arm quickly. So that, let's go back to your in backswing. Notice that his elbows are more or less at the same level. To shallow the club shaft, he has to adduct his arm so that the right elbow, you see, is lower than the left. And the more you want to shallow it, the more you have that look. Notice also that he has to develop right lateral bend to accommodate. You know, with your right shoulder has to go down plane to allow you to shallow the club shaft. But let's go back and do that. So you can see he's adducted his arm. Notice to keep his right palm parallel to a progressively shallowing plane, his right forearm has to be supinating more. So compared to the end backswing position, at this position, his left forearm is more pronated and his right forearm is more supinated. Now, hold that position. Because if you look now, you'll notice that the club shaft, he still has a geometrically flat left wrist there. So the club shaft is still in line with his forearm. But notice that the club shaft is no longer in line with his upper arm. See, because he's shallowed the club shaft. So if you shallow the club shaft in your downswing to a shallower plane, that means that your club shaft and forearm on a shallow plane than the humerus, which means you have what we call an intact left forearm flying wedge, but not an intact left arm flying wedge. And I'm going to try and do this to show you the angle difference. I'm putting that in line with his humerus, and you can see there's an angle. And that angle difference represents the shallowing action that you do. Now it's going to get more complicated and more interesting. I said to you that if you use this technique of a swinging action with an intact flying wedge, you have the options how you want to do it. Do you want to look like Ben Hogan and Hunter Mahan through impact, or do you want to look like Bryson DeChambeau? Now, what effect does this accumulator number 3 angle have on your ability to square the club face? If you look at it at this point here, notice this is what we call the P5.5 position. The club face is still parallel to my watch face and the geometrically flat left wrist. It's also parallel to the inclined plane. But that's open to the club head arc. Now, if the club releases and catches up to the left arm by impact due to what we call the release of power accumulator number 2, it would be wide open at impact. And you would push slice all your things. So in your late downswing, you have to perform what Homer Kelly called a power accumulator number 3 release action, which is a rotary motion of your left forearm to square the face. That just has to happen. Now, how much do you rotate it? And the answer is it's inversely proportional to the strength of your left hand grip. So here I am with a neutral. I'll do it with a racket because it's easier to see. Because this racket face is just so easy to see in space. So here I have a neutral grip. So this racket face is exactly straight in line with my geometrically flat left. Now, look how much I have to rotate it to get it onto, let's say you have an inclined plane here. I have to rotate it a certain amount. Now, if I strengthen my grip at rest, before I even grip the club, turn my hand in a left forearm pronatory clockwise direction, you could eventually rotate it 60 to 90 degrees and get what's called a very strong 4-knuckle grip. If I did that and then held it, notice I wouldn't, at that, I'm going to hold the racket face that way. See, the racket face faces the target, but I'm going to turn my hand to as strong a grip as I can. Notice, in the backswing, I wouldn't have to rotate my forearm because it's already fully pronated. So the club face, you notice, is square to the club head arc, roughly. So in your late downswing, you don't have to perform a power accumulator number 3 release action. So golfers who use a very strong grip like David Duval and Daniel Berger, Jamie Sadlowski, long drive competitor, use that grip. But the majority of golfers use a neutral grip. And some, like Ben Hogan, used to use a weak grip, and John Rahm, the Spanish golfer, uses a very weak grip, and Jordan Spieth uses a weak grip. And a weak grip, is not where this is at 1 o'clock, it's at 12 o'clock. That's very weak. So the weaker your grip, the more you have to rotate it in the backswing and the more you rotate it. Now, this is where it gets interesting and complicated. I mentioned to you that if you have to perform this rotary motion, at what time does this club start to rotate to square? When? Certainly P5.5 it hasn't started to rotate. P5.5 to P6 the club is releasing, because most people release the club in the plane of the flying wedge here. But starting somewhere here towards impact, this counterclockwise rotary motion is going to happen. Now the question becomes, how fast is the club face closed during this zone? And the answer is, it's very much affected, presuming you have a neutral grip. So we're presuming you have a neutral left-hand grip, and you know you have to do this motion. So watch my back of my hand. It rotates towards impact so that my watch face in the back of the hand faces the targeted impact. And then the question becomes, what's happening to the club face during this time? How fast is it closing? It obviously has to close from this open position to get square, but how fast is it happening? So, go back to the different grips. I'm going to adopt a large accumulator number 3 angle, like this, with a finger grip. And then I'm going to hold the club shaft facing the camera like that, and I'm going to rotate my left forearm in a pronatory direction like that, by about 45 degrees. Look at the club face. Notice the club face looks like it's actually staying square to the club head arc, right, in that thing. Notice how much the club head moves in space with that 45 degrees of rotation. It angles a lot, right? The club head's arc is moving 18 inches, maybe even 2 feet. Now, adopt a mid-palmer grip, like Mo Norman used to stand like that, and Bryson DeChambeau. Hold it in front of yourself like that. And I would very much encourage you to duplicate everything you see I do, because if you can't duplicate it, you shouldn't believe what I'm saying. So here I am, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to rotate my left forearm 45 degrees in a clockwise direction. So I'm going to pronate my left forearm. Watch. Notice I've turned 45 degrees, and you can look at your radial bone relative to your antecubital fossa. Notice how much the club face is closing. And notice that the degree of annulation, in other words, the amount of club head travel, is less. Now, why is that important? It's because it explains what happens in terms of the timing and the speed of this power accumulator number 3 release action. So I'm going to demonstrate, and I'll get Jim to demonstrate it with a golf club. We'll start off, I'm going to hold it with a small accumulator number 3 angle, duplicating a golfer who comes down the turn shoulder plane with the arm outstretched at impact. When you do that, notice as the club releases, try this at home. Notice, let the club release to its maximum degree. Just let it uncock. Notice how close it gets to catching up to your left arm. See? But it's very open, right? And then, to square it in your late downswing, you're going to have to quickly rotate it to square. Now do the opposite. Hold a finger grip like this, and then get up to your ping and just let it uncock. Notice, if you let it uncock, it never catches up to the left arm, right? Look at this angle. You have a lot of forward shaft lean, and it's open. Then, as you rotate it, there's a greater distance and more time to square the face. And the importance of this is that if you want to have a low ROC, so we have this idea like Jim Hardy states in his RIT release, that you're going to hit the ball more accurately if you could keep this club face square to the arc for a longer period through this impact zone down as you're getting in the late downswing and early follow through. And you can see that having a larger accumulator number 3 angle makes that more possible. What's the disadvantage? The disadvantage is that you're giving up club head speed, because there are two sources of club head speed in the PGM swinging action. The first source, and the major source of power, is what we call the release of power accumulator number 4, and I'm going to get Jim to demonstrate it. So where do you get power in a golf swing using a TGM swinging action? At his end backswing, he's elevated his left arm and adducted across his chest, and we call that loading of power accumulator number 4. Then in the downswing, this is what's going to happen, and I'll just do it with my arm, is you're going to use the active pivot action to pull your left arm, and eventually it's going to separate from your chest. And that swinging motion of the left arm supplies most of the power activated by the pivot. In other words, the pivot is the workhorse that causes it. So that we refer to as the release of power accumulator number 4. The second power accumulator that gets released is the uncocking of the wrist like that, right? That's a major source of power. So there are two power sources. One is the release of the left arm, and then sequentially the release of the club. And the more lag you have, and the more motion you can have of that, the more power you get. So let's go to we'll do it down, let's do down the line. And we're going to use a mid-palmer grip, because we're going to try and mimic a golfer who wants to come down like Bryson DeChambeau, come down a steep plane without shallowing the club shaft. And he's going to come into impact with a small accumulator number 3 angle. So he releases, okay, that's how it looks like. You see, no shallowing, coming down into impact looking like that. Now, why is that good for power? It's good for power, go up, is that with a steeper arm, if he was more flexible like Jamie said last year in the long drive competitors like Tim Burke, this club would wrap around his body and beat down somewhere there. So it gives a much longer arc to come down steep. So what long drive competitors do, they have a big arc and they just pull their club down the turn shoulder plane without shallowing. Then, as it releases, the amount of release I said to you, just let it release fully without rotating it. And just feel an end point. You should feel that it almost catches up to your left arm at a certain point, but you still have to square the face. So the disadvantage of the technique, it's the way to swing a golf club with the maximum speed, but it has the disadvantage that you're giving up control in terms of accuracy, because you have very little time to square the face. Now, if you wanted to do the opposite, if you wanted to have the maximum control, then you should do the opposite. So let's take a finger grip with a large accumulator number 3 angle. Go to your end backswing. And then he's going to shallow it down to the hand plane or to the original shaft plane. Notice when he gets to this point over here that the club face is now nearly square to the arc, and in the last 2 foot before impact it's rotating very slowly. So it has that feature in common with Jim Hardy's RIT release. Now, I'm going to explain now why I believe that Jim Hardy is inaccurate when he claimed in his book that when you get to this position, the club face is already square to the arc, and then in the late downswing, from this position to impact, it's square all the way. And I'm saying that's impossible. Now, in his book, and at the end of this video, I'm going to actually, I've got his book here and I'm going to put it in front of the camera to show you a particular drill that he does to demonstrate this phenomenon. He states, he holds the club like this, and in front of him like that. And he says, what you do to avoid it is you perform a motion like this around your body. This is a drill, feeding. He does it horizontal to the ground, and then he does it at a 45-degree angle. Now in this drill he says the key thing is there's no rollover of your forearm, right? Now, if he did it the way I'm doing it, I would agree with him. But in other words, if you had here your radial bone in line with your antecubital fossa, so that you have a neutral forearm, you went back and kept it neutral, right? And just bent your wrist. Notice that the toe is pointing straight up. Then if you came from that position and all you did was keep your forearm neutral but swing around your body like this, then you can see that the club head face is always square to the club head arc. And if you kept straightening your wrist like that, straightening it, without rolling your forearm, then it would still be square. So you could do that. Now the part that I agree on is that if you straighten your wrist without radially deviating or ulnar deviating your wrist while you straighten it, you could avoid any roll motion at left wrist level, and that's called circumduction. So yes, I could imagine you could keep it square. Now you could keep it square from even here if it was square here. And I'm going to do it with the racket again. Now, I'm doing it with the racket because you can see the face. So here the face is square to the arc. If I took my hand back there, notice it's still square. I've bent this back, this square, this part is facing up. Now, as I come through, notice how it stays perfectly square to the arc. So this is what Jim Hardy intends. But in reality, he's not doing that. Because if you look at him as he goes back there, he doesn't keep his right forearm neutral. He actually supinates it. He does this. So he's actually doing this motion. He's supinating it in his own demonstration there. Notice it's not vertical to the ground. I'll do it from this way. This is, I'll do it without neutral forearm. See, this is vertical, and I'll do it like Jim Hardy does. See, it's open. It's 45 to 60 degrees open. Now you would say, well, maybe he made a mistake in the drill or something. And the answer, no. Because remember, in the RIT release, the feeling is throw-in from the top. Yeah. But if you look at any golfer who's a one-plane swing golfer, who's doing this throw motion with the right arm, and you look at them at this position, look at their right palm. It's under the club. It's not vertical. It's this position. It has to be, because they're shallow in the club. So Matt Kuchar, who starts more or less there, by the time he comes to here, he's already shallowed it down towards his original shaft plane, which I call the hand plane. If you look at him, this is what he looks like. If you look at the club face, it is not square. That's square. It's open. Now, in the first half of from P6 to P6.5, it closes. So by P6.5, it's square. From P6.5 to impact, it's square. So I would agree with Jim Hardy if he said that the club face is square to the club head arc through most of the late downswing and certainly through the follow-through. I would agree. But not through the early part of the downswing. I believe it's closing. It has to close a little bit. And I'm going to demonstrate that this is actually happening in Matt Kuchar's swing at the end of this video. Now, why am I going into the trouble of doing that? The reason is, if you think about it, the degree of closing in his RIT release between P6 and impact is identical to the speed of closing of a golfer who has a large accumulator number 3 angle. So I'm saying, therefore, you have a choice. I certainly can understand why golfers might be attracted to the RIT release because of the idea of squaring the club face to the club head arc and then keeping it square through impact, because that is a great advantage. But I'm saying you could do it the way Jim Hardy describes, or you could do it with the intact flying wedge technique as I described, but do it with a large accumulator number 3 angle. Now, I'm going to show you some interesting differences between these two techniques. So just imagine you're at this position, the club face has to be a little open, and it's going to be squaring in the first half, and then it's going to be pretty square in the second half. Now, Jim Hardy, in his RIT release, talked about how you throw it. So right arm throw, continuous smooth motion. You don't want to have this left arm impeding it. Now, in the swinging technique, TGM swinging technique, using an intact left arm flying wedge, it's the left arm that's doing the swing. So what does the right arm do during the late downswing? So this is what it does. So when you're at this position here, in contrast to Jim Hardy's RIT release, the elbow is more likely in front of your hip, not on your shirt sleeve. And then in the late downswing, it does two things. The right elbow straightens, the right arm straightens, and your right forearm starts to pronate like that, so that you can come into impact with your right palm facing the target. So what usefulness does that have? So imagine you here doing this power accumulator number 3 release action with a large accumulator number 3 angle. As your right arm straightens, it starts to push against your base of your left thumb, which Homer Kelly called pressure point number 1. And if you push with your palm as your right arm straightens, you can synergistically help to smooth out the release to make it more fluid and more efficient. The second thing you're going to have the advantage if you do that is you could help to stabilize your flying wedge through impact. Because when we go through impact, you want to keep the club face square to the arc. And to do that, I said to you, you have to avoid flipping, and you have to avoid left forearm supination. All motion from impact for the next 12 to 18 inches is controlled either through an external rotation of your humerus in the left shoulder socket, or through the turning inside left of your shoulder. And see, as you go through impact, your body is turning up and inside. So the motion of your left shoulder socket in space allows you to control the flying wedge. Watch this. Notice how I'm keeping it square to the club head arm. Now, the right wrist, as it straightens through impact, can help it like that. And it's equivalent to a two-handed tennis shot. So you see, some tennis players play tennis one-handed, but you could theoretically put your second hand on it to smooth it out like this, right? And what would it be doing? The one thing you would never do if you were a two-handed tennis player is straighten your wrist. Because the moment you straighten your wrist, you start to put pressure on the club shaft below what's called the coupling point, at pressure point number 3, and that will flip the club past your hands. So any straightening action of the right arm must be combined with a bent wrist. Watch that. So the characteristic feature of a golfer who is using this technique, and I actually believe that Hunter Mahan's using the technique, and I'll explain later when I analyze his swing why I believe that, is that if you look at a golfer who's going with this technique, he'll look like an RIT golfer because he'll come down to the shaft plane. But a distinctive feature will be, as he goes through impact, that this wrist will look bent, like Lee Trevino, like that. See, this is stable. And this helps to give us stability. Now, I am very worried about a straightening right wrist because of a timing issue. So let's start to make more comparisons between the technique I describe, which is the TGM swinging technique, using an intact left arm flying wedge with a large accumulator number 3 angle, which allows you to look like Hunter Mayer, look like Keegan Bradley or Ben Hogan. If you want to play golf that looks like an RIT release, back to your original shaft plane, I'm going to show you some important differences. Now, in Jim Hardy's description, we're now going to talk about how do you power the swing, right? In Jim Hardy's description, he said in his right arm swinging action that the power came from 2 sources. The one source, he said, is what he called the feeling as you're coming down from here, and you're throwing with your right arm. Your hands come very close to your body, traveling on this inner circle. And it's a feeling of a centripetal action, keeping your hands close to the body while the club is flying outwards. And he said that's a source of power, the centrifugal. I find it a bit problematic because I believe that that motion is really probably the release of power accumulator number 2, the release action. The second source of power, he stated, was the throw action. In other words, from the very start, if you were thrown with your right arm, you could generate a lot of power just with this throwing action. And he believes that a key component is to straighten your right wrist through impact like that. Because it says it creates an additional whip-like action and increases your speed. Now, obviously, there are many people using RIT release with great success. But for me, the problem I have with it, having tried it for many years, is that if you have this concept of doing this motion right on throw with a straightening wrist, getting your left hand out of the way, you have to time this throw with the right wrist. So at impact, Jim Hardy said it should be halfway between bent and straightened. So it's a timing feeling, right? And if you're good and you time it, you have no problem. Maybe you square it and you keep it square to the arc. But to do it well, it's not that easy, I think, if you can't pivot well, because Jim Hardy emphasizes how your body has to rotate through. So I have an alternative way to perform a right arm throw action swing. And I have written review papers on this, and I've spent many years actually playing with the right arm swinging technique. And I'm going to describe 2 different techniques of how it's done. But one thing characteristic of my technique is that the right wrist stays bent. So let's start off how I think a right arm swinging action, if you want to be a right arm swinger, is actually powered. And I believe it's powered through 2 motions. The first motion starts from your end backswing, which is this adduction motion of your right arm, see? So the right arm, which is there, moves down, so your elbow moves towards your side, and that's a right arm adduction throw motion. And I've often referred to that as power accumulator number 5, just using Homer Kelly's power accumulator concepts, to say, yes, that could be a tremendous source of power. This motion, look at it. Now, when you're doing this motion, what you need to do to give it even more power is to get the right shoulder to move down plane with it. So let me give you an analogy. If I wanted to punch someone, I could produce a lot of power by straightening my arm like that. Punch. If I wanted to apply more force, if I lean my body forward and got my right shoulder in motion while I do that right arm straightening action, I could apply even more power. Right punch. Because now I'm using a certain level of body power. So in my right arm swinging action, I see the first half of the downswing is powered by the right arm induction maneuver combined with the right shoulder moving down plane, like that. At this point, the right arm straightens, and that's the source of power. And Hobart Kelly called that power accumulator number 1. So in my right arm swing in action, I describe it, is that you're going to get power from 2 sources. Release power accumulator number 5, which is a certain degree of pivot motion, and a right arm straight in action. But notice I keep the bent wrist. Now why is that so important? So let's go back to playing tennis. When you watch a tennis player hit a standard shot where he's not hitting topspin and he's not hitting slice spin, but he's just swinging his arms level to the ground to hit a forehand smash, what does he look like at impact? He looks like this, right? The racket face has to be facing his intended target. It's square. Notice this is bent. How bent is it? The answer is the degree of bend at impact depends where the ball is. So if the ball, if he timed it incorrectly and the ball was already here, his right wrist would have to be straight to get his racket face square. But most tennis players move into the ball, which means they're hitting the ball in the middle of their body or head of their body, somewhere in this zone. And therefore the right forearm at the time of impact is angled at this angle. It's not thing. Which means to get a square face, you have to have a bent wrist. And I think it's the same thing in a golf swing. That the most reliable way to perform a right arm swing action, I think, this is just my personal bias, is that notice how this is now square to the arc. I come into impact with this bent, and I go through impact, same as Jim Hardy's. The only difference is I don't straighten the right wrist. So it's a swing in action like this. Now you would ask the question, don't I lose some power? Because Jim Hardy says that the straightening wrist allows that club to whip through. And I believe, it's been studied actually, that the amount of power that you get by straightening your wrist is very small, because most of the power comes from the release of first power accumulator number 5 and then power accumulator number 1. And the disadvantage of trying to get extra power straightening your wrist is you've introduced a timing element in that action. Now, if you are a golfer who's using the RIT release because you've used it for years and you're doing it successfully, there's absolutely no reason to change. But if you're a new golfer and you're saying, I like the idea of a right arm throw action technique, which I call a right arm swinging technique, I would just say to you, well, you have 2 options now. You could do it like the way Jim Hardy says, like the straightening, or you could do it with a bent wrist. Now, I'm going to show you another way of doing a right arm swinging action. And that is, in Jim Hardy's description, he says the left arm never pulls, and the left arm is not a power source in his RIT release action. It's all coming from the right side. And I've just described one variation of a right arm swinging action where it's all powered from the right side. But it is possible to perform a right arm swinging action where you get some power from the left side, and I'm going to demonstrate that. So what I've done is I've taken a string here to represent my left arm. And I'm going to try and get the string to be the correct length. It takes a bit of adjustment here. So, if it's taut, it's equivalent to a straight arm, see there? Now I'm going to take away my left arm. Now I'm going to perform the equivalent of a golf swing. Notice that this is taut. Now if you were swinging using the technique that I described previously, let me just loosen this a bit, where you form release power accumulator number 5, then 1, if that was your only power source, and your pivot was just sort of reacting in space, this would get pretty limp. You see through impact? at no time does it feel like it's pulling your hand. But watch this. What happens if I do this? If I get to end backswing and I start with a pivot, see? Notice that I'm turning space, an active pivot action. Notice that this is pulling my club and my right arm down due to the pivot action, and then I finish it with a throw. So that's an alternative way to form a right arm swinging action. So that's a combination of the release of power accumulator number 4 through the pivot action. So it's almost a combination of a bit of left arm swinging in the first half of the downswing, followed by a pure right arm swinging action in the second half of your downswing. And I believe that if you're a right arm swinger, you could use both actions. But when I would teach the right arm swinging, I would teach the idea of keeping this bent, not allowing it to straighten. Now, I'm going to get to the part that interests me the most. And that is a section of Jim Hardy's book where he talks about the one-plane hybrid golf swing. Now, what do we mean by a one-plane hybrid golf swing? So, what he means is you could play golf as a one-plane golfer, which is a feeling of swinging your arms more around your body rather than an up and down motion across the front of your body standing more or less erect. And what you would be doing essentially is you would be shallowing your club shaft so that your right arm would, instead of looking like that, would be just, this would be more horizontal, because you almost look you're going to be ready to do an RIT release, because you're coming down like that, so your right arm is in this position. But what you're doing is you're having an LOP release. So remember that Jim Hardy said that an LOP release is defined as when this club is coming down the shoulder plane. So you're coming to impact there, you're not coming into the impact down here. So you could be what he calls a hybrid. So watch this. Notice that I'm shallowing the club shaft here and my right arm's in this position. And now I'm letting my left arm straighten, but I'm coming into impact not like a one-plane golfer with a large accumulator number 3 angle. I come into impact like that. Now, Jim Hardy said if you do that, this would be disastrous. Now, I'm going to actually read out of his book so that I make sure that I quote him. Now, why? And I'll refer you to this. So, I'm going to read it directly unedited from his book. The one-planer with an LOP release has a club shaft and a club face that rotates shut during impact with incredible speed, like a loose rudder. Now, in the next page, in figure 7.5, he actually has a figure of a golfer who's performing this one-plane swing with the LOP release, and he says, the problem for a one-plane hybrid using a LOP release is the club shaft comes into impact more upright than the forces of the swing with the club face very open. As the more horizontal one-plane swing forces hit the upright shaft, they spin it closing incredibly fast, much like the loose rudder on the end of a boat. With a high ROC club face whirling from open to close with such uncontrollable speed, repetitive shots are almost impossible to achieve. So what he's basically saying is, certainly the way I interpreted it, is that if you have your right arm more like a one-plane golfer, like here, in a position where it is capable of pushing or throwing with a certain amount of force, if it then applies any force to the shaft, because in the LOP release, you're coming into impact on a steep plane, what he calls an upright plane or shoulder plane. You see, but the forces from the right arm are potentially, it could do this, watch it, like that. See, like it says, like a loose rubber boat, that your club face will rotate through impact with tremendous speed. In other words, if you think you had a problem with the LOP release, when you were trying to learn how to do that, he said if you try to be a one-plane hybrid, you could even have a bigger problem where the club face will be totally uncontrollable through impact because of the forces from the right arm. So he says, how do people solve this problem? So he says there is a solution. So let's see his solution. Because he says there are some very successful golfers who use this one-plane hybrid technique, and he actually says they are the straightest hitters of the ball in golf. Now, how can they suddenly be straight if they had to deal with this problem where they had a high ROC through impact? And the way they do it is the following. To be a successful golfer, well, these successful golfers don't need to let the club face close. So he describes that what you could do is have a shut face club position. So you could either have a very strong left hand grip, or you could have a bowed wrist, which would close your club face to the club head arc. And he said if you adopted those two techniques, where you shut the club face relative to your arc, then he says you don't need to let the club face close. He says because of their shut club face positions, they are already fairly square to the path and the plane. During impact, they simply don't release. They use every part of the LOP release except the release part. They don't allow the forearms to rotate, and they don't allow the club head to pass from the right side of the hands to the left side of the hands until well after impact. In other words, they block out the release and drag the club shaft through impact. Because of this, they have a very stable club face. In fact, they are possibly the straightest ball hitters in golf. Unfortunately, there are two things they give up to gain their great accuracy: speed and height. They tend to be average to a below average in length. They aim to the left and swing inside to the right. So let me interpret what I've just read to you. He's stating that if you are going to come into impact, I'll do it from down the line, with an LOP release. By that I mean it's on a steep plane where this is almost in a straight line. You couldn't afford to use your right arm to push against the shaft and pronate and therefore throw the club shaft uncontrollably through impact with a high RC. So he says what they do is they hold off the release, which means they don't use their right arm, which means he states that they drag in the shaft and not allowing the release to occur. In other words, he thinks of it as a dragging action like this. And he uses an example as Jordan Spieth. He says Jordan Spieth is a one-plane hybrid. And the other example he uses is Lee Trevino. Now, this concept of dragging is a problem, right? Because you don't want to perform a swing in action where you suddenly come near impact and you hold off and you drag the club like this. Because you simply can't swing fast like that. But I believe that there is a one way to do that swing action with the alternative technique, which will actually not only make you the straightest golfers, but it will make you the longest. So let's go back to this concept. Go back to the TGM swinging technique with an intact flying wedge. I said to you, all the power comes from the pivot, releases power accumulator number 4, then releases power accumulator number 2, right? And that's where you get your power. And then you just swing in this out like that. Wham! And the long drive competitors who have clubhead speeds of 150 miles an hour and hit the ball 400 to 450 yards use that technique. Now, what do they do with the right arm? Some of them, like Jamie Sadlowski, is a one-plane hybrid. So if you look at Jamie Sadlowski, I'll first describe Joe Miller. Joe Miller, who won the competition, he looks like this knee pain. And the other one is Jason Zuback. So you see a lot of long drive competitors look like that. That is a typical LOP release. But what Jamie Sadlowski does is he looks like this. See, this is there. Now you would say, is he blocking his release because this right arm's there? And the answer is no. This function of the right arm in this technique, as I said, it can help you to roll it square, but you're not pushing it through impact. In other words, you're still swinging with ultimate force. So I'm going to post an image and a YouTube video of the golfer who's probably the longest driver in the world today on a consistent basis, who won the 2014-2015 long drive competition, and that's Tim Burke. And he, hits the ball 400, 450, and he uses this technique. So he uses the left arm flying technique. The only difference is when he gets to this position, he bows his wrist and he comes into impact, bowed, then he keeps it through impact like this thing. But this is just a swinging motion activated by the pivot, like that, through impact. And his right elbow looks like this. But the key difference is, you can see as he comes to impact, you can sense he stops pushing. In other words, he applies a certain amount of force that helps him to square the face. But it's a pure swinging motion. This one just has a synergistic help in releasing power accumulator number 3 and helping to guide it through impact. So I believe that if you use this TGM swinging action with the intact left arm flying wedge, you could become look like a one-plane golfer. In other words, come down to this plane, but still use the small accumulator number 3 angle. And another golfer who used that technique is Dustin Johnson. So Dustin Johnson, if you look at him from down the line, at impact, he has a small accumulator number 3 angle. But his right arm looks like this. It's way down. He has a lot of right lateral bend. He looks like he's swinging around his body. And he's throwing. But when he throws, he doesn't throw and straighten. When you look at Dustin Johnson through impact, he's got a bent wrist, still bent, and this is bowed to here. And then eventually it straightens there. And Dustin Johnson is not holding off his release. He's releasing with tremendous power. He's one of the longest drivers on the PGA Tour. Interestingly, he's also one of the straightest drivers on the PGA Tour. And the reason why I believe he's straight is because he's using the anti-flying wedge technique and a drive hold hand release action. So when you use the big advantage of this anti-flying wedge is that when you come into impact, you can use a drive hold. It just works so well. Right? I'm going to end the session by Jim here has some images we're going to show you on his laptop, which we're going to show you. And I'm also going to have all of these images in the information section below my YouTube video. And I'm going to be describing certain things here, but you might have difficulty seeing. But if you listen to what I say, and if you don't quite see what I'm going to be demonstrating in these images, then you can look at the images, which I'll have links to in my information section, and then more clearly see what I'm saying. But before that, I'm going to let Jim just introduce if there's any questions or comments that he wants to make from his own perspective, because he's listening to this for the first time. He's never heard me talk about this topic.
Yeah, it's been a great presentation, Jeff. I really like the detail that you gave. One of the things you said is that long drive competitors do not get into that inner circle RIT release.
Yeah.
All of them have a small accumulator number 3 angle,
Yeah.
and they're all extended, okay, out like this. Do you think that a golfer could use that swing for the drive, and then more of the inner circle concept for their irons?
Yeah. So the long drive competitors want to get this left arm and club moving at maximum speed. That's their priority. So if you look at them, the arms are extended away from the body, they're not here, and their club releases what we call a centrifugal release. Do it from up the line. So if you look at them after impact, the arm is separated from the body, not towards the toe because they turn in left, but it's separated. The other type of release is called a CP arm release, stands for centripetal, where you come through impact and your hands are moving inside left like that. See that? Now, this CP arm release works very well for a golfer who swings on the inner circle. So if you come in, so you come from the turn shoulder plane all the way back to the, I call the hand plane or the individual plane, and you're doing either the RIT release described by Jim Hardy, or you're doing my variation, which is it's a TGM swinging action with a large accumulator. You essentially have your arms and body very closely coupled. And the more closely coupled your bodies and your arms can go through the impact zone, the more control you are in of the club head and the club face. And therefore, in your follow-through, you're going to finish like this. That's a CP arm release. Dan Hogan finishes like that. Hunter Mahan finishes like that. Around your body, you're not going to finish like a long drive competitor out there. So in terms of maximum control over your club shaft, your club head and club face, I think this inner circle, whether you use Jim Hardy's RIT release or my variation, which is a TGM swinging action with a vertical arm and a large accumulator number 3 angle, is the way to go.
Okay, so you think a golfer could swing 2 different ways?
Yeah, so for short irons and mid irons, he might choose to use that technique. And for his driver, he might decide to be a bit reckless, give up a bit of control for maximum driving distance. And then you could change your grip. You could use a finger grip for your short irons, and you could use a mid-palmer grip or a low-palmer grip for your driver swings. So that you have all these options in terms of doing it. But I believe that if you want to maximize distance, an active pivot action is the way to go. Now it's interesting, I forgot to describe, in Jim Hardy's LOP release. All right, let's go back in time to that one. Where does the power come from that? I forgot to mention this. In Jim Hardy says that when you're a 2-plane golfer, so you stand pretty erect and you're sort of turning your body more horizontally while your arms are more up and down across your body. He said that in the LOP release, the 2 sources of power is essentially you stall your left arm at impact while your left shoulder is going up. And he says that as your left shoulder goes up and this hand stalls at impact, you get a condition of leverage where you can lever the club, right? And he says the second source of power is the concept that as you pronate your right forearm and whip the club head past like this, that's a source of power. So there are 2 sources of power. Now, again, I have a problem with that in the sense, in my own thinking, I'm resistant to the idea of ever stalling the forward motion of the left hand. And then I'm also resistant to the idea of suddenly going from a left arm pull-in action to a right arm hitting or a right arm swinging action in the same swing. Because now you have to time it through impact. And it's associated with a high ROC. So I would suggest that if you want to hit the ball a long way, and you want to come into impact with the LOP release in the sense that your arm's more extended away from the body with a small accumulator number 3 angle, the best way to do it is like Dustin Johnson, is to come down and let it do that, but have your right arm there, which allows you to control it better. Another thing I forgot to mention now that I mentioned it, in the normal standard LOP release, watch this, the club head comes down like this. Watch out as the club releases that through. Notice how open it is. And you have to square it in the end. Now, if you're using the technique I described of the one-plane hybrid using the left arm flying wedge technique, the club face is squared much sooner. And the reason is, and I'm going to put images of Tim Burke, who's the world long drive champion. And what he does is when he comes down to here, he's bowing his wrist. And as he bows his wrist, look at that club face, it's closing. So if you look at the images, by the time he gets there, it's almost square to the arc, even though he's using an LOP release. So if you bow your wrist and use what Jim Hardy calls a shut face technique, you can use an LOP release with a club face that's relatively square to the arc for a much longer period of time. So you get the advantages of speed and some accuracy. And with your right forearm in this position, I think it just allows you more control than if you just throw your arms out like this, both arms straight, like Phil Mickelson tends to do. And he does these driver, he's a roller. He does this through impact. Very high rate of closure. And it's interesting that Phil Mickelson, who uses a high ROC for his driver, is such a good short iron player because he uses this alternative technique where he's more on the inner circle. And he turns with his body and he uses that alternative technique.
So Jeff, just a little bit more on that right elbow. So are you saying that Mickelson could be more accurate with his driver, but still have a small accumulator number 3 angle if he did more like Dustin and kept his right elbow in more of a pitch position?
I do believe so, and the reason is, if you look at you're coming down and you pull it, right, like this. The club in a LOP release like Phil Mickelson, it's pulled, look at it, it's still open and it's 18 inches from impact. And then you just hope to square it. Now, this arm, if you watch Phil Mickelson's rear arm, I'll do it from down the line. His right shoulder is so high, he doesn't get his right shoulder down plane. His right arm straightens. I mean, before he even comes to impact, you sometimes see his right rear palm lose contact with his lead thumb, like this, looks like that. So it's essentially not helping him to control this speed of release of power accumulator number 3. But Dustin Johnson, because he comes into this position, as your right arm starts to, what we call paddle wheel to impact, as it straightens and pronates, that can control the speed of rotation, see? Even though you have a small accumulator number 3 angle. So you can get more control.
One thing we talk about is that you don't want to run out of right arm.
Yeah.
And so keeping this bent allows you to not run out of
That's
right arm.
a key point. I'll give you an example.
Yeah,
To do the RIT release, or the equivalent, as I described, you really need to go through impact with a lot of rotation of your body. And the rotation of the body allows you to get your right shoulder down so that you don't run out of right arm. Because Jim Hardy states in his RIT release that you should get up to waist level without pronating this arm, and you have to turn your body to do that. And that allows you to get your right shoulder down plane and so on. If you didn't turn your body, this right arm would straighten prematurely and you couldn't effectively complete the follow-through easily. So if you look at Lee Trevino, I think he was unbelievable. I mean, he was down there, he went through impact like that. And Hunter Mahan is one of my favorite golfers who doesn't run out of right arm. And we'll show images of Hunter Mahan, and I'll show you just how unbelievably good he is at not running out of right arm by getting his right shoulder down plane with a lot of rotation. Ben Hogan was unbelievable because he had such a good pivot action, rotating through.
I know you taught me before, Jeff, that if the right arm straightens, then it also the right forearm will pronate more easily. Does that make sense? Seems like you told me if it stays here, it's easier to not over-pronate.
Yes, I mean, this common sense means that if you're in this position with a certain degree of supination, as it straightens, it's very difficult to keep it supinated unless, see how I turn my body? I can keep that supinated. But if you don't have it and the right arm straightens, it would tend to pronate and roll over. So that's why in Jim Hardy's RIT release, he emphasizes the fact, when he describes the pivot motion, how important it is to be turning through, through impact, so that you don't have a tendency to pronate and turn your forearm counterclockwise.
Okay, awesome. Well, the last few weeks I've been working on, with my irons, this concept of swinging on the inner circle, doing a drive hold release, keeping my body turning, and I've never had such good accuracy. My irons have just been exceptional, and one of the questions I've had is that my driving distance has kind of decreased. And to me, this video answers the question of how I can get more power with my driver, but maintain my accuracy with my irons.
So you can switch from one technique to the other. So what we're going to do now to conclude this is we're going to approach the camera, because I've just got my camera on a tripod over there, and what we're going to essentially do is Jim is going to hold his Apple computer, laptop, in front of the camera, and I hope the camera focuses on the screen, and we're going to go through a number of capture images that I've made of different golfers, and I'm going to just point out certain features. Now, if it's not very clear when we do this, that you can't see exactly what I'm demonstrating, then you could, as I said, open a link to those capture images in another tab and watch those captured images while you listen to me talking at the same time. But let's see if this works. So I'm approaching the camera, and I'm going to use this little paint stick when I put on a little thing that's red on the end to point at things. And Jim is now going to come towards the camera here with his laptop, and he's going to try and get it that it fills the screen, and he's going to try and hold the laptop square. Okay. Now this is Matt Kuchar. And what I wanted to show you, this is what he looks like at his end backswing position over here. And you notice that he has quite a steep turn of his shoulders, but his left arm is slightly below his shoulder turn angle like that. Now you can see as this is starting his early downswing, he's starting to shallow out the club shaft. And here he is when he's shallowed it out down to his desired plane, which is close to the original shaft plane or the hand plane. But look very carefully at his position. You'll notice, and I'm pointing it exactly, that his right palm is facing skywards. In other words, to be in that position, his right forearm has to be supinated. It's not neutral. In other words, when Jim Hardy says, if you had a neutral right forearm at your end backswing, like I'm pointing here, with it 90 degrees relative to the club shaft, he said if you came down with a right arm throw action, it would automatically become square, the club face to the club head arc. And I'm saying that's not possible. And in fact, if you look at his club face here, it is not square to the club face arc. And we'll do some more images, and I'll show you that it's actually slightly open to the club head arc. And it's open to the club head arc because his right palm is parallel to the inclined plane, parallel to the shallow club shaft, right? Okay, let's go to another image, next image. So I'm going to just press down, right? So here's a close-up image. So I'm going to post this one here, and you can see that his club face here is open to the arc there. And here I've got him where his club shaft is right on his forearm. And that's a very desirable position because Jim Hardy said that when you perform the RIT release, you shallow, as you do the throw, you never want the club shaft to get below your right forearm. Because when you get to this position at waist level, it should be on the forearm. But if you look at his club face here, it actually is slightly open to the club head arc, which has to be because if you look at his right palm, it is slightly supinated. So I'll go to the next image here. And here's some more images. Now what I've done on this image is I've drawn some lines here on his left arm. Because what I want you to see, the blue line goes through the middle of his left antecubital fossa, and the red line is drawn over his radial bone. And what you'll notice that when he's at the P5.5 position in image 1, his radial bone is rotated clockwise relative to his antecubital fossa. And as the club releases, you'll see by the time he comes to impact towards image 4, it's now rotated. So if the left arm is rotating in that manner, the right forearm itself must be rotating. Now, look at his club face here. In image 2, it's not square to the arc. It's slightly open. Now it's more square, and by there, it's definitely square to the arc. So the point I'm making, Matt Kuchar is the prototypical one-plane golfer who uses a RIT release. And even if you look at his swing, the reality is there is a certain degree of club face closing between P5.5 and P6.5, and then it's pretty square by P6.5 through impact and beyond. So I'm going to go to the next image. I think I skipped one. Okay, here's an image where I've got a face-on view of Matt Kuchar. And this time I've drawn lines on his right arm. So the blue line is his antecubital fossa. The red line is over his radial bone. And you can see here at P6, I think that's P6 or P5.5, you can see that this is to the right of the blue line, which means that his forearm is rotated clockwise. It's in a supinated position. And you can see that as he gets towards impact, the red line is moving closer to the blue line until eventually it's neutral here as he reaches impact, which means that he's pronating his forearm, which means his right forearm is rotating counterclockwise, even though Jim Hardy says that is not happening. So here is another one of Matt Kuchar demonstrating the same phenomenon. Notice that at impact, it's neutral. The red line's in line with the blue line, and it's square. Notice after impact, at this position, it is fractionally passed. Now, although in other words, he's starting to pronate even though Jim Hardy says one shouldn't be pronating the right forearm during this time period below waist level. Now, what I'm going to do here is to compare. In the top images is Matt Kuchar, and the bottom images is Hunter Mahan. And the important thing to note is what they look like as they get through impact, which is image 2, to image 3, which is post-impact. You'll notice that Hunter Mahan still has a bent right arm. His right shoulder is very far down plane, and he still has a bent wrist. While look at Matt Kuchar. Matt Kuchar's shoulder is less far down plane. His right arm is straightened, and his right wrist is straightened. So there is a big difference, actually, in the way these golfers are performing this swing action through impact. So let's look at it. I think the next one's down the line. No, I think I must have skipped it. Okay, here's a down the line view of those two golfers, Matt Kuchar at the top and Hunter Mahan here. I want you to look at image 3, which is at about the P7.5 position post-impact. If you look at Matt Kuchar's club face, it's actually close to the club head arc. And you look at Hunter Mahan's club face there, it's square. And I believe the reason why Matt Kuchar's club face is closing is that he prematurely pronates his right forearm, starting at about 7.5, while Hunter Mahan has this ability to go to P7.5 and still prevent any right forearm pronation. And one of the reasons, look how more rotated Hunter Mahan is at impact. His pelvis is more open, his upper torso is more open. Also notice another important difference is if you look at Hunter Mahan's hands, it's very close to his body because he's going on the inner circle and he's using the CP arm release. While if you look at Matt Kuchar's hands, it's further away from his body because he's slightly towards what I call a CF arm release action. And a CF arm release action often causes, as we discussed earlier, a tendency to pronate your right forearm. I'll go to the next one. We did that one. And here, this is Tim Burke, the long drive champion. And I want you to look at his action. So here he is coming down in the early downswing. And you can see he's coming down a steep plane and his club face is open to the path. Notice that when he gets to impact, he has a small accumulator number 3 angle, right? But if you actually look at his club face here, it's actually surprisingly square. This is at P6.5, I think, and that's probably P7, image 3, P7. Look at the club face relative to the arc, and you'll notice it's surprisingly closed. And the reason is he's bowing his wrist. Look how bowed his wrist. Plus, look at his right elbow. It's in a more horizontal position with more right lateral bend. You know, in other words, pointing out the thing. Look, interestingly, at Tim Burke at P7.5. His club face here in image 5 is still square to the arc. This is a guy who's swinging club head speeds of 150 miles an hour, and he still can keep his club face square to the arc, which is, I think, remarkable. And here's a face-on image, and on the face-on image, it's easier to see the club face. Notice how square it is at these different positions. And here he is at impact. Notice that the club shaft's in line with his left arm at impact, and he has a slightly bowed, slightly palmar flexed left wrist. And in image 4, he's at P7.2, which is the end of the immediate impact zone. Notice that his club shaft still hasn't bypassed his left arm, and he still has a bowed wrist. So he's using, I believe, a left arm swing in action with an intact left arm fly-in wedge and a drive hold hand release through impact, which allows him to keep the club face square to the arc. So that's very good for accuracy, and yet he has the maximum club head speed because he's using a small accumulator number 3 angle coming down the turn shoulder plane. And I think I'm going to end it at that one. Oh, this is Dustin Johnson. So here's Dustin Johnson at impact in the top image, and this is the equivalent position face on. Notice that he has the club shaft in line with his left arm. His left arm is outstretched away from his body, and he has a small accumulator number 3 angle. But he's a one-plane hybrid, because look at his right arm where it is, how horizontal it is, and look at how much right lateral bend. Notice that he's swinging around his body. Now, this image here is at impact, and this second image is after impact. Look at his club shaft. It's still in line with his left arm. So he's going through impact as a drive holder. Notice that his club face is square to the club head arc. So he's using a technique that allows you maximum speed, but a lot of control through, one, the bowed wrist, which allows him to keep the club face square to the club head arc in his late downswing, so that he has a low ROC through impact, and then he uses a drive hold technique through impact, which gives him maximum control. And yet we know Dustin Johnson is one of the longest drivers on the tour. Okay, thank you. And I'm going to do one more thing, and that is I'm going to just point a diagram here in Jim Hardy's book. And I will post this particular image on my website, on that YouTube video in the information section. So I'm going to get Jim to hold this here, see if we can get the camera to focus on this image over there. Tilt it a little down so it's okay. There. Now this is figure 9.1 in the book on page 141. And it says here, one plane throw-in drill level to the ground with no rollover. So I'm going to start first with image 3, where he has his club face facing and then you can see in image 4, he's bending straight in his right wrist like that, without pronating his forearm, as he describes. But look at image 2, right? Image 2 is when he bends his wrist back to the P6 position. But look at his right palm. If you look very carefully, his right palm is partially facing skywards, which means that his right palm is supinated. So if you look at this image here, where he's supinated, when he gets to the neutral position, there must be a certain level of right forearm pronation or right forearm counterclockwise rotation happening, even though he claims there is none. And this is a problem for me in terms of my interpretation of Jim Hardy's book. Now, interestingly, this troubled me a lot, because I said what I see happening in real golfers who are using the one-plane golf swing and the RIT release is I'm seeing this pronation happen. I see it in Matt Kuchar swing, and I saw it in Sergio Garcia swing and Hunter Mahan swing, and I said, it's incompatible. So I decided to join the Facebook forum, One Plane Swing Facebook forum, but I didn't use my own name, because any time I use my own name, they won't let me join the forum, I've found. So I came up with the name Peter Lannington to join the forum, and I posed a question there. And I said there, it doesn't look to me that, I'm genuinely interested about this problem. It looks to me that in the RIT release, there is a certain amount of right forearm pronation in the first half between P6 and P6.5. And I drew lines And Chris O'Connell, who works with, responded to me. And he said, no, he denied that the right forearm is pronating. And he said as an example, he said, if you turn your arm like this, so that this non-hairy side here, which is called the ventral aspect of your forearm, is facing upwards or facing the camera, and if I just swung my arm like that, and if it keeps on facing upwards, of course it's not facing the camera anymore because the camera is there, but as long as then you're not rotating. And I agree. If you kept it like that, it would seem to be that way, right? That you're not rotating your forearm. But the fact is, you should never be looking at your upper forearm to decide whether the forearm's rotating. You have to look at the lower forearm. In fact, you should look at your hand. Because if your hand is turning in this counterclockwise direction, doesn't matter what your upper forearm's doing, if you are doing this, that is a left-right forearm pronate reaction. It's not a wrist motion. And it's interesting, in Jim Hardy's books, he defines 6 wrist motions. He talks about hinging motions, extension, flexion of the wrist. He talks about up-cocking and down-cocking, radial deviation, ulnar deviation. And then he talks about supination and pronation, and he calls them wrist motions. But they're not wrist motions, they are forearm motions. And I believe the reality is that in the RIT release, when you're in this position, and your club shaft is on a shallow plane, you have to be supinated. So there has to be a certain amount of rotation to get to neutral. And you can get to neutral well before impact, and then to keep it neutral through impact and after impact. So I'm just going to conclude with the following statements. Basically, I've contrasted whole different ways to think about the golf swing, how it's performed and how to perform a release action. In Jim Hardy's release actions, he's given you 2 alternatives. He said you could be a LOP release golfer, but that's associated with a high ROC through impact. And I believe that I can't understand if you want to be a skilled golfer who plays golf at a professional level why you would ever want to use a high ROC swing. So it means you could choose the RIT release, and I have no problem with that. So if you find that works very well for you, and you can perform it perfectly like many professional golfers can who use that technique, then, like Matt Kuchar, go ahead and use it. But I'm also saying that there is a totally different way of thinking of the golf swing, as I've described today. I was thinking of the golf swing as being a swinging action of the left arm, where you maintain an intact left arm flying wedge, where the entire flying wedge, while it's swinging in the downswing and follow through, is always on plane. And when you come into impact, you can use a drive hole technique, which allows you to keep the club face very stable through impact. And the interesting thing with this technique, what's so useful about it, is you could swing on 3 different planes. You could come down to the hand plane, or you could come down more outstretched like Bryson DeChambeau, or you could come down to what I call an intermediate plane, which is the elbow plane, like Adam Scott and Henrik Stenson. So you have all these options in that technique, and I believe it's a very versatile technique. And the other great advantage of that technique, I believe, is that it can be activated with an active pivot action. And I still believe that if you want to hit the ball 300 to 400 yards and play, like Dustin Johnson or Brooks Koepka, Justin Thomas, then you are using an active pivot action. And if you're using an active pivot action, then this TGM swinging technique fits in so well with that. Well, I think that's about it. And I'm just going to turn off, let Jim stay here, and I'm going to turn off the video recorder, and I hope you found that of value.